Good afternoon and welcome to this event hosted by the Good Information Project. This is an initiative of the journal.ie, and the whole purpose of this is to educate the public on what is good information so that they can avoid the bad information. And it just so happens that this month we'll be focusing on disinformation and misinformation, which are both fancy terms for false information. So we're here this afternoon in the Hub at University College Cork, and we're going to be discussing with our panel of experts the tools, tactics and strategies about how we can fight the online disinformation war. And of course, asking the question, can we even fight it? Can we win it? Is this just part of being on the internet these days? I'm Brianna Parkins. I'm the journal's resident fact checker. And first up, we're going to be hearing from our panel of experts, and then we'll have time for audience questions afterwards. So if anything crops up in discussions that piques your interest, or if there's something that you just missed you and you don't know what it is, feel free to put your hand up. We'll have time to get back to it at the end. So I should probably introduce our panellists to my left. So we'll kick off with Barry Andrews. Barry is a Fianna Fáil MEP since 2019 and a member of several European Parliament committees, including participation in a Committee of Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, which includes disinformation. Sorry, that was a mouthful.
It off the tongue.
Yeah, it really fits in there. That's why I have to read from a piece of paper, because our panellists have so many achievements. So I have to actually make sure I have this written down. And of course, there's Dr Eileen Culloty, who's kind of known as Ireland's major expert in disinformation at the minute. And she's the coordinator of the Ireland Hub of the European Digital Media Observatory, which the journal is also part of, which promotes scientific knowledge of online disinformation, advances the development of EU fact-checking services, and supports media literacy programs. Eileen is also Assistant Professor of the DCU School of Communications and Deputy Director DCU of the Institute for Future Media, Democracy and Society, which I think is Fujo, goes by the nickname. And of course, we have Stephen McDermott, who is our assistant news editor, a reporter and editor at the journal FactCheck unit. He also edits my work, so I have to be really careful when I talk about him. And Stevie is very interested in researching, analysing, correcting misinformation across a range of topics, from public health to climate change to the war in Ukraine. Stevie's excellent fact check from maybe 2 months ago. He fact-checked the Taoiseach when he claimed that Sinn Féin had blocked 6,000 houses from being built, and found that claim misleading, which is one of our most ever read fact checks. So we're going to kick off today's panel. I've asked each panelist to do a bit of a show and tell, and to bring me in their favourite piece of false information that they've come across. Stevie, let's kick off with you.
Yeah, so I kind of cheated a bit and I chose two, but I chose them because they're actually so similar, and I've no reason to, or nothing that kind of can prove this, but I kind of suspect that one might have influenced the other. So I'm sure everyone remembers in 2019, late 2019, this rumour started going around. It was like a screenshot of a WhatsApp image from what seemed to be a bunch of friends who were, had their own little WhatsApp group. It was called Old Times or something. And a message came in from an individual called, or supposedly called anyway, Gibbo, who told
Sounds
everyone.
very reliable.
Who told? Well, it seemed real. It seemed like we're just getting a glimpse into some people's communications, and he appeared to be someone who's a member within the British Army, or kind of had knowledge of the British Army, and said that the Queen had died of a heart attack, and that it was going to be announced the very next day, and for people to pack a load of supplies, and these are the military drills that were going to be happening, and so on and so forth. That really stood out to me, because I remember at the time my mother was on holiday in New York, so they're 5 hours behind, and I woke up to a text next morning saying, "Oh, there's rumours flying around everywhere that the Queen has died. Can you confirm this? Can you verify this as a journalist?" As if I had some kind of royal knowledge.
You have a hotline to
Yeah,
the Queen,
exactly.
yeah.
I just pick up the red phone and I'm onto the Queen. So that was the first one. And the second one, just a few months later, was when Ireland, we were only gone into, wasn't even full lockdown, so the date the pandemic officially started in Ireland was the 12th of March. I think it was the 18th to the 19th of March. Really, really similar WhatsApp voice message went around from someone who was supposedly within the Defence Forces, said, "Here's a military drill that's happening. Ireland is going into status red lockdown." Again, completely unverifiable. They said, that an official announcement will be made at this date, this huge moment of uncertainty. And it's kind of really hard to get to the bottom of that and say, well, this is why it's not happening until the government announces it's going to be the next day at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. It's kind of hard for it to say that this isn't going to happen until that moment passes. And it hasn't happened, and it's like the Queen. You know, we all know that the Queen is alive, but when all this misinformation floating around, it's very hard to disprove that. So.
Yeah, I remember that was probably the one that everyone got. Everyone got the forwarded, the voicemail, and people started stocking up on dry pasta that day. But it was so widespread, and like people did buy into it. You know, mums, uncles, everyone was sending it on to us. Eileen, what's your favourite piece? When I say favourite, this could mean the one that made you laugh, the one that made you think, the one that's actually quite hard to disprove, or the one that was very effective.
Well, of all the conspiracy theories that have gained prominence in the last few years, I've been really fascinated by the flat Earth conspiracy theory. So this is the claim that the Earth is not a globe, as we've all been told, and as scientists say, is really easy to prove that it's just a flat disk. And it's fascinating because it just seems like there's so little at stake there. It's not like vaccines where there's a massive implication for public health or some of the political disinformation. It just seems like there's very little at stake, and the people involved, they don't care about the evidence. And so the gulf between the people involved who seem to quite enjoy it, have this community, they meet up a lot, they make their own documentaries. Yeah, they have these conferences that actually look like they're really good fun. And then you have these scientists who are just exasperated because to them it's just this ultimate rejection of scientific evidence. And I think it's interesting because it maybe suggests that what's driving conspiracy theories doesn't have a lot to do with evidence, and if we focus too much on that, we mightn't be getting very far. But secondly, whenever I hear scientists say, you know, the physics is so basic, I just think it's so basic, but I wouldn't know how to disprove them myself. And I think a lot of the claims that we talk about, there is this challenge of we have to just assume the authorities are right. So it kind of addresses that as well.
We hit upon that. We did a debunk recently. There was a picture of an ice shelf in Antarctica. That's the wall. That's where you hit the edge, and that's where the Earth stops. I was doing this fact check, and Stevie's like, yeah, but you have to write about the physics. And I was like, yeah, I know I have to go and ask physicists why the Earth can't be flat. And it's actually really difficult to do because you have to learn about the curvature of the Earth and things spinning around to actually disprove something that you would just take for granted as knowing it's the truth, because fact checking has that higher burden of proof. You have to really be able to show you're working. So I went down the rabbit hole for about 2 days looking at why the Earth has to be round. That's a really, really good example. And Barry, what's your piece of information?
Well, I think it was probably what was retweeted by the Russian embassy in Ireland recently from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Moscow about the delivery of 40 tons of phosphorus to Ukrainian nationalists, and that was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And it reminded me of much of what I had seen and heard when I was working with Goal in Syria, where Russian disinformation had a very profound effect on the course of that war, particularly the white helmets, the Syrian civil defense, and this idea of false flag claims which were made in relation to chemical attacks. So it felt to me like a lot of what was being now played out in Ukraine had been road tested to some extent in Syria. For my part, and just the first fact check of today, I'm not necessarily an expert on disinformation. I'm a member of the Disinformation Committee in the European Parliament. So I bring that insight into the work that I do. And I think also I bring my experience of running for elections and what that is like now in the era of social media platforms where everything is run in that context. And back in 1999 and 2002, when I started running for election, and none of this was part of the way in which we had to run these elections. So that's that. I mean, there's so many other examples. There was a successful one in relation by the Russians in relation to US providing biological research into biological weapons to the Ukrainians, which is all part of that same false flag narrative, which we have to be pretty careful about. So there's a bit of an anticipation there going on in terms of identifying that kind of narrative in circulation at the moment.
Yeah, we're going to continue on with Ukraine, just because I feel like we're seeing in real time how parallel online information war is happening alongside a military conflict. And we know that propaganda has been part of war, since we've been studying it and it's been around basically. But is there something different that we're seeing now, Eileen?
Yeah, well, I think Barry's absolutely right when he goes back to Syria, because while it's true that across wars throughout history there's always been these processes of dehumanizing, of denying that atrocities have happened and so on, but it was in Syria with this explosion of digital media which became very important to document atrocities, and then there was these narratives just denying that those atrocities, so you just deny that the images are real, saying that the people involved are crisis actors. And with Syria, one of the very peculiar things was just the different stakeholders or different people who came to share that narrative. So there was the Russian disinformation narrative, also a lot of US conspiracy theorists who would say that a lot of mass school shootings were just crisis actors. So then they would endorse the idea of that, well, there are crisis actors in Syria, and now they're saying there are crisis actors in Ukraine. And I think that's one of the maybe scariest things at the moment, is that you just get these very strange bedfellows that will happily overlap and sell each other's narratives, which can be very confusing then if people are just seeing that online. And it's leading to a lot of that whataboutery as well.
Can I just pick up a point there? Because the White Helmets are the Syrian civil defense. And they were the subject of a disinformation campaign in Syria. And this was picked up in not just in the European Parliament, but also in the Irish National Parliament by certain far-left politicians. And they repeated these narratives, and it had quite a calamitous effect on the White Helmets and in their operations. We do see, people immediately think of far-right amplification of this Russian narrative, but in fact it also happens on the far left, more so in Ireland.
Recently you were quite critical of your two fellow MEPs.
Well, there was a convention in the European Parliament that you didn't speak up against your other MEPs from Ireland. We wore a green jersey. That was the convention for 20 years. But that was the one issue where I drew a line. Now, I gave a speech in the Parliament criticising the far left MEPs, although I gave the speech in Irish. I don't know why I did that with simultaneous translation. But so that convention is no longer applies, because these matters are far too important.
So you're so passionate about the issue.
It's not just me. I think there's a phrase in French where les extrêmes se touchent, they come together. And whenever you see votes in the European Parliament on questions of disinformation or support for Russia, you'll find a preponderance of support or opposition, both on the far left and on the far right. And it's an extraordinary feature of this whole debate. And
we were talking about there how elections were different in the 90s to now. And unlike other conflicts, this is sort of one of the first we're seeing broadcast on TikTok. We're almost watching this live streamed. I'm getting, my TikTok is now videos of Ukrainian soldiers doing dances to like Cardi B on tanks. It's a very bizarre thing. And the internet seems to enable false information to spread faster and wider, but we're also seeing these large OSINT communities being able to pull together to verify footage and document war crimes. So Eileen, do you think the online world is helping or hindering accurate information about the Ukraine conflict?
Well, I think the development of the open source investigations, which came from Syria, so the innovative outlets like Storyful here in Ireland come from that time as well. When a lot of the news media were saying, we're getting these unverified images and videos from Syria, we don't know what to do with them, and then people came along and said, well, we can verify them. And that's emerged into this very vibrant community. The question then becomes, though, how are they funded to do that investigative work? So a lot of those have taken funding, say, from the European Commission or from Google, and then they're accused of not being fully independent by the same disinformation actors. And I'm not sure that the public has a good awareness of that open source investigative work. So I think there's a bit of work to be done, even with things like fact-checking, to explain what it is, what it's trying to do, and that maybe then there would be, people would find it easier to know where to go to actually get correct information.
And Stevie, what do you think in the fact-checking realm? I know that we're able to go on Google, we're able to check satellite images in Google Maps and even weather reports, and reverse Google image search has been such a godsend to us. But on the flip side, we're now having to fact-check a hell of a lot more because there's more of it coming in from every angle. Do you think the internet is terrible or wonderful when it comes to fact-checking?
I mean, I don't think it's a good or bad thing. It's just that it's a space. It's like information is out there in the world. We've always had ways to disseminate information. it's great in the sense of, in the way even journalism has changed in the last number of years, where something you'd have to go down to a library for before, or to kind of, ring a lot of people, now you can find like very, very, very quickly. But like you say, the flip side of that then is that there is more information out there to debunk. You see instances of something that has been debunked in one language and it gets kind of translated into another language, and people can kind of learn off each other quite quickly. And I guess the other side as well is you have online communities where people who might before have been more isolated in their beliefs can link up with each other, and it doesn't have to be like people within the same physical community. It can be a big global community, and that creates its own echo chamber as well. So there are benefits journalistically, absolutely, but I do also think that it has probably enabled the much more rapid spread of disinformation that we're seeing, and allowing it to kind of morph and change. And I think the other really important thing to think as well is that there's quite often what I call it's like a spaghetti effect with misinformation. We see it a lot with Russia, so they just throw spaghetti at a wall and see what sticks to it. And when you have no limit online, how many tweets are sent every second, how many people are posting on Facebook every day, a certain amount of that will stick, no matter how outrageous it seems and no matter how ridiculous it does seem. Someone's going to pick it up somewhere and it's going to travel along and just keep going. It's actually a real challenge to us, and yourself as fact checkers. There's very much a whack-a-mole thing going on where you think you get something and it just crops up somewhere else, or crops up in a different form. So I don't necessarily know what the solution to that problem is, but certainly, as I say, the internet does also help in the ways that you can research that and try to debunk it.
You talked about the spaghetti tactic, spaghetti at the wall tactic, which is, I love, it's a visual description of what's going on. Can we talk a bit about the classic tools? Is there a bit of a playbook to disinformation? Are we seeing tried and true tactics being used again and again?
Yeah, speed is another one, I would say. Misinformation always thrives where there is moments of uncertainty. So you see something like, again, I go back to the examples I used of that status red lockdown warning on WhatsApp, when nobody knew what was going to happen. We were in this completely, in a modern sense, unknown place. Governments are introducing public health restrictions that are stopping people from travelling 2 kilometres outside their own home. Shops are being shut. Can't go to school, you can't go to work, you can't go to college. And something like a status red lockdown is very, very conceivable. And of course, that's turned out not to be the case, but where you have the kind of a narrative that can be disseminated quite quickly and gets out there, that helps the spaghetti stick to the wall in this instance.
And it's almost could be semi-true almost.
Yeah, exactly. And anything that is believable, if something rushes in to fill that space, that's where it starts. Obfuscation is the other big one. I think some of the most sticky disinformation narratives are the ones that have an element of truth in them. One of the best examples of that I can think of is kind of towards the end of last year, let's say September, October, COVID figures were rising again, and most people anyway, had been vaccinated. And so people who were anti-vaccine were saying, well, there's 50% of the people who are in hospital are unvaccinated and 50% of the people are vaccinated. So it makes no difference whether you get vaccinated or not. And obviously those figures are true, and you can go and look them up and you can see that that is the case. But of course, when you actually drill down to that, you see, well, if 90% of people have been vaccinated, then the people who are unvaccinated make up a much higher percentage per head of population as people who are in hospital. And you could see then that what the people who are anti-vaccine are saying isn't necessarily true, but it's just taking the facts and distorting what's actually the reality is going on. And that is probably the biggest disinformation tactic there is that's out there. It's convincing people when they even go to do their own research that what they see will be true, but when you miss context around something, that's again where misinformation thrives as well.
Yeah, I mean, stats and figures can be manipulated, and let's face it, no one wants to go back and check the numbers. If you don't have a maths brain, it's incredibly tricky and boring, and you don't want to necessarily get into it all the time. So that's definitely one tactic that we're seeing. Barry, is there anything that you're seeing on the committee coming out time and time again as a thing that we should keep an eye on, or maybe like a red flag?
Well, I mean, Stephen's point is like the grain of truth is always a difficult one to debunk, because you have, for example, I talked about the biological research cooperation between the US and Ukraine, and that has happened. The US has been involved in this in post-Soviet countries for the last 20 or 30 years, but it's run by the Department of Defense, not the Department of Health. So you're thinking, why are the Department of Defense running biological research? So it therefore allows a proliferation of theories to develop around it, and so there's some kind of point that allows it to gain traction, and it's one of the few of these issues that had actually cut through. And Fox News are repeating this, and Tucker Carlson is repeating this, and Lavrov praised Tucker Carlson just a couple of weeks ago for his the positions that he'd taken. But I think we also, what we saw in the committee is a common thread through conflicts where journalism isn't present. So this is what happened in Syria. Journalism, clearly no Western people could be present in...
after Marie Colvin died.
Absolutely. I mean, these are all no-go areas in northwestern Idlib. And so there was, there were local journalists, but there was no major institutions present there. So, Stephen makes the point that is the current age better? I think it's slightly better, because now we have, albeit there are places like Mariupol are very hard to reach. In fact, work by Bellingcat and can carry out really excellent work around verification that wasn't possible in 2014, 2015, when IS was beginning to have a presence in Iraq and Syria. And if you go back to the Bosnian War in the 1990s, the information that was coming out was sketchy, and people began to think, oh, well, they're as bad as each other. And that's what really I'm afraid of in Ukraine. As they get more frustrated and a lack of support from the West, Ukrainians will radicalize in the same way it happened in Syria, the same way it happened in Bosnia. And then you get this narrative of, well, they're as bad as each other. This is a hopelessly violent part of the world, a hopelessly corrupt part of the world, and we've contributed to this mess by, this, that. And that feeds into the Russian narrative, which is kind of something that we should be able to anticipate now and be able to work on. So that's one of the themes that come up in our committee. But we heard from a very wide range of experts, including Peter Gagan, who gave evidence about the Brexit referendum and Russian influence in the Brexit referendum in the UK, and the incredible story of the DUP running ads in London for £500,000 in the week before the referendum, with a wraparound on the Metro newspaper, and nobody knows where this money comes from. How come we don't know where this money that came into the DUP that was used? How come we don't? Because under the Northern Ireland political system, such is the sensitivity that donations to political parties are kept secret to protect the identities of individuals, because of the sensitive nature of politics in Northern Ireland. So we heard from all of those experts. The committee came to an end about 3 months ago, but it's been renewed. So it's an unusual situation. It's not a full committee of the Parliament. It's an ad hoc committee, but we've decided to renew it, and it will continue on for the rest of the mandate.
Thanks to the current events. Eileen, you literally wrote the book on disinformation. Like you have a book on disinformation. I think it's one of Ireland's only dedicated things to this subject. In your experience, in your years tracking this, have you identified a go-to playbook thing that straight away that's disinformation? Is there a tried and true method here that you can kind of share with others as a way of recognising it from the bat?
Well, I think first of all, when we talk about disinformation, it's like this catch-all phrase for an awful lot of different things. So you have conspiracy theories on the one hand, you have these organised campaigns, which is kind of what we've seen from Russia. You have political advertising, as Barry was just talking about, is a massive grey area that needs proper regulation. And then you just have a lot of people speculating, and people who have just very biased ideological opinions. So it can be quite hard to disentangle that. But I think the one thing that anybody can watch out for is anything that claims that there's some great competence on the part of our political leaders or any institutions to somehow get together and organise on a grand scale to deceive the public, because there's no evidence that any government or institution has been able to succeed at that ever. And yet an awful lot of these false claims ask you to take that in. And it's about making people angry about things that aren't happening when there's lots of reasons to be angry about things that are happening that we do know about. And I think that's why I think it's so destructive, because it kind of misplaces people's emotion and energy in the wrong area.
So what you're saying is if you can't get an appointment with the HSC for 3 years, they probably don't have the competency to poison us all with vaccines.
Probably not, no.
I kind of like that approach. So we're going to move on to something a little bit more hopeful. I mean, we're talking about Ukraine, and one thing we noticed in the FactCheck disinformation space is tools like the classic FactCheck being weaponized to spread false information, which is not great news for people like me who do this every day for a living. But does it mean that we have to change tactics? What else should we turn to, Eileen?
Well, there's this alternative approach called pre-bunking. So instead of debunking something after it's gone out there, you tell people about manipulation tactics, which is a lot of the things Barry mentioned there. So you tell people already, we've already seen from Syria that there will be claims about crisis actors, and then people will know when they see those claims, oh, this is a tactic. And then they're less likely to believe it. So there's some good evidence that actually works. So one way to do that would be to roll it out through media literacy, to maybe even integrate it into fact-checking, but to make people just more aware of how people are trying to manipulate them in the public.
And Barry, if the bad actors are using fact checks, which we as like think of ourselves as the good actors are using, does this mean that we have to do something different aside from pre-bunking? Do we just abandon that in its entirety?
No, I think there's been just a massive sea change in attitudes. That was if you go back 10 years, the Baltics were experiencing all this disinformation. They were the first to feel it, the Eastern European countries. And they were coming to the European Council and they're saying, look, this is happening. And they were accused of kind of anti-Russian hysteria. But events that happened in Syria, events that happened in the US with Brexit, with the Macron's campaign in particular in 2017, generated a new interest, and then suddenly reports were being generated not just by defense ministries but foreign ministries across Europe. And our committee was established, and we've seen a scaling up, not just of issues to do with disinformation, but any type of hybrid warfare, which includes cyber attacks. There's been a huge development of interest in that. And I think one of the things government concludes is that we, the government, should stay out of it and outsource this work of helping people to be more media literate, helping people to anticipate problems like, as we describe it as pre-bunking, should be outsourced to academia, to journalism,
but
to
why should
CSOs.
It be outsourced? Why can't we run government
because
campaigns?
at the heart of the conspiracy susceptibility is a doubt about the government. And therefore, if the government is spouting on about disinformation, it's a long way to go to get to what you're trying to achieve, which is to try to endow people with the skills in order to be able to, to be able to see what is from a dubious source, and then to be able to anticipate what's coming in the future. I think that work is best done by CSOs, by academia, by journalism in the first instance, and that's where it's come from. You mentioned Storyful, Bellingcat are doing the same thing, and they're arming people, and now people are much better able for it. But the one thing I will say is there is a certain hard-to-reach part of the population that are still hard to reach.
Who are these people?
I think, for example, during the pandemic, a lot of the new communities in Ireland were really not interested in being vaccinated, and I'm not, to a certain extent, they were influenced by disinformation about the vaccine. And there are studies done about the need to segment the population to people with higher educations, people with lesser educations, age groups. And to tailor the response to the segmentation of the population that's necessary. So I think that's coming along. So I must say, I'm quite hopeful about this area. Maybe it's because I'm stuck into the sort of problem-solving side of it in the Parliament. But I just say one thing is it's about trying to protect democracy, because essentially disinformation seeks to undermine democracy, and democracy is in retreat across the world. It really is this democratic recession, And disinformation is part of the way that democracy has been undermined at the moment. So it's really critically important, but I would consider the situation to be improving.
Just picking up there on talking about tailoring your message to populations. So we at the Journal commissioned a poll from Ireland Thinks, and we found that 68% of our respondents said that a fact check had not changed their beliefs or opinions on an issue, which was depressing enough, right? But then when we looked at the demographics, and things changed rapidly when we kind of looked at age, education, people's backgrounds, class, and what they were earning. And the results, they went to, so people under 40 with a university education and an income over 50K were more likely to have their mind changed by a fact check, whereas older people with lower incomes who maybe hadn't gone to third level education were less likely to have their minds changed by a fact check, which was genuinely surprising because my parents are massive nerds for fact checks and they're older people who didn't finish high school. So when we're looking at this thing, do you think we need to change our tactics of fighting false information depending on our audience? Do we need to kind of, maybe fact checks work for these people, maybe something else works for that person, Stevie? Do you think we should be changing it up?
Yeah, I thought one of the more interesting points in that poll was I think the percentage of people, like one of the questions that we asked was, have you spotted misinformation? Have you been susceptible to misinformation? And one of the highest levels of people who said that they hadn't seen misinformation, been susceptible to it, were people who didn't vote. People who are like not engaged in the political system, the exact kind of people who, when we're talking about conspiracy theories, are the ones who are kind of saying, "Oh, the system is rigged. Oh, I don't, believe in this." But obviously, would think, well, something that we at the Journal would say that's misinformation. They would call us like the fake news media or whatever. When you're talking about kind of trying to change tactics, those people are going to be very, very difficult to reach, particularly because they think that, again, people like the Journal who are doing fact checks are stitching up the system in such a way that is like, leaving them outside of it or such like that. I think there's obviously people who you can't reach, but it's time and time again when you hear about, what conversation can you have with people. I think empathy is a big thing. You think of, I'm trying to think of, a belief that someone would hold not incredibly dearly. So a position on like, for yourself, like think, your position on like.
Okay, so my brother genuinely believes that the pyramids were built by aliens.
Yes.
Like, just genuinely does. And I'm like, you know what, I just let it go. It doesn't hurt me, it doesn't hurt him. Do you know? This is my brother.
Oh, your brother. Okay.
And that example.
But there's nothing, what can you do to try and change his mind? Like, it's like, the sky's blue. Well, no, the sky's green. Like, we can sit around arguing about this all day, but eventually, if we keep arguing, we're going to fall out about it, right? But if it's something more middle ground, like, I don't know, should corporations pay more tax, or should Ireland remain neutral, or things like that that are much less, I guess, polarised in society? And you think, well, what's the best way to kind of, if yourself and myself were to have a conversation about it, like, how would we do it? Would we just start throwing facts at each other and saying, no, you're wrong because of this, and this is a fact? It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. We kind of have a conversation and say, well, this is what my view is, and I don't know what your view on that is or whatever. And it's much more constructive, and it's much more, you talk about like if a battle is winnable or not. Like, what battle are you trying to win? It's like, I think, in a lot of cases you can't approach something like it is a battle that needs to be won. It is just a conversation. It's just, you're not trying to convince someone of something. You're trying to hear them, you're trying to listen to them. And look, if you don't get, through to them and it's not harming anyone else, like your brother say, like, so be it,
It doesn't really affect, like, if it was a harmful thing that was going to maybe stop him from going to hospital for a condition, or, he didn't get his kids vaccinated and they're a high risk, I think we'd have a bigger argument. But I was like, just let him go. Like, he's harmless enough. And like, they could have been, like, I have no proof they're not built by aliens, realistically. So when we're talking about, Eileen, have you noticed that there is sort of different tactics for different audiences? And should we be adapting this? Is it a one-size-fits-all approach?
Well, I think that the tactics are broadly similar, but just different cases will appeal to different audiences. But I think what you were saying about whether the fact check changed people's minds, it's probably not the criterion of success for a fact check. The fact checks don't have to change people's minds. It's very unlikely that they would, because it's very hard to change people's minds. If you think about so much money and effort goes into things like political campaigning, it's really, really hard to persuade someone, or advertising. to persuade someone to buy a particular product, to vote a particular way. So it would be really odd if a fact check could come along and just change their mind, because it's often, there's a lot more going on than just whatever the facts are. So I think the value of the fact checks is that they provide a resource to other people. Somebody has done the work, like the one you did around the housing. The work is there, that's a resource, that's a valuable thing in itself. And really, the issue with disinformation is so complex, there's so many different factors to it that we need a whole range of actions. So some of that is, rethinking education and the role of critical thinking. So are people coming out of our schools as critical thinkers, or are they coming out as rote learners? That would involve rethinking how we go about education, not just adding on a new module on media literacy or a workshop on disinformation. I do think there is a role for legislators and regulators in that it's okay to say we need to outsource to academics and to media to do the work, but for media to do the work, they need to have money and funding. For academics to do the work, they need to actually get data that's valuable, which for over 6 years, the platforms have just not provided. So regulators have to make them provide that data. Or those weaknesses in the media system, that's a policy problem. So for CSOs to do the work, I think regulators have to create the environment first.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. That's not in contradiction with what I was saying. I mean, we have now the Digital Services Act, which is not an act as such, but it's in preparation in the European Parliament. That's really going to be critically important to force the platforms to comply with the legislative requirements that we're going to put in place. So that will make a significant change. But what I'm trying to say is that the actual face-to-face work, I think needs to, government has a credibility issue here. But yes, you're absolutely right. The legislative and the policy framework has to be in place in order for this, and the funding has to be in place, particularly for journalism, for good journalism. And it's an asymmetry between how strong social media platforms are financially and how weak mainstream media is by comparison, that has allowed all of this to proliferate.
Just on that, it's worth noting that the big tech companies are now the biggest lobbying spenders in the EU. So they're outspending in Brussels, the financial services and the pharmaceutical sectors. So, and while this new legislation is going through with the Digital Services Act, you have massive spending coming from a tech sector that's trying to protect itself. So I think that's quite difficult, I think, for ordinary people to understand. So we have this huge concern about disinformation, this general consensus that something must be done, and then the nitty-gritty issues are actually very, very difficult to work through.
Steve brought up an interesting point there, talking about, there are some battles that we can't win. So I want to put it to you all one at a time. What do you think is the battles that we can't win? When should you not engage, and when should you just walk away, Barry?
Well, I'm not sure we can afford to walk away from any of this. I think the Economist Intelligence Unit identified that less than 7% of the population in 2022, of the global population, lives in full democracies. It's an incredible figure when you think about it. Less than 7% live in full democracies in 2022. I mean, we thought we were the end of history 40 years ago, and now we have a global democratic recession. And the stakes are really high, and disinformation is just one part of it. When I'm campaigning in 2019 for the European Parliament election, I can't go into this area to canvass. The restrictions from social media platforms are pretty high. Certain businesses won't allow people to be candidates. There are so many more restrictions on running in elections nowadays than there were 20 years ago. So all of this really matters, and disinformation is a critical part of it, and how we deal with it. I don't think there's an area that occurs to me immediately that we can simply walk away from. I think the stakes are far too high.
And just quickly there, talking about the difference of elections and information shared online. I'm imagining back in the 90s, if someone wanted to put out some damaging information about you, they'd have to go and deface your poster with a big black texter, and now they just do it online. Have you noticed that there's been a change? Has it become more nasty? Yeah, it's totally nasty now. I mean, compared to, if somebody wanted to spread information, they'd ring up a newspaper, and they'd tell the newspaper, and the newspaper say, if I don't have two sources, I'm not interested. Nothing I can do about it. Sorry, it might be true, but defamation is such as it is. Whereas nowadays, I see somebody maybe
putting out, repeating a narrative that I suspect is probably not correct. And I'm a little bit nervous on a Friday afternoon about it, debunking it or trying to challenge it, because my social media will now be flooded with nonsense and aggression and vitriol. And it's, there's a certain anxiety among politicians about getting into that space because it is so nasty. So that's why it's so important. We have to make sure that our social media platforms are responsible. We heard from Frances Hogan in the European Parliament just at the end of last year, and her description of Facebook algorithms is just chilling, because she reckons there's only sort of 150, 200 people in the world that fully understand it. So what chance of regulators? And she says with a flick of a switch we could change, we could protect children, we could take away all of the divisions that are created by the way the algorithms operate. That was her testimony to the European Parliament. She did the same in the Congress. And so, there's a huge amount that we have to absorb in the legislation that's going through at the moment.
And Eileen, are there any audiences that you would just go, you know what, let them go, I'm not going to try and reach them, debunk them? Is there any arguments that you think that we should walk away from?
Well, I think when it's a more personal thing, like people you know or family members, just like you were saying with your brother, we all have points where we just go, just let them off, And that's fine, because it's a more personal scenario, and that's about managing your personal relationships. It's when it's at a social level and you're talking about our democracies or science that it becomes more problematic. And I think scientists are quite strong on this when they will not let a fact go. Like I was saying about the flat Earth, they would not just say, oh, it's just a trivial, silly belief. To them it's fundamentally important, you cannot let it go. I think the issue with politics is that there aren't facts in the same way, or often the things that people are arguing about are not facts in the same way that we have established scientific facts. You can't bring out the physicists to do a demonstration. So one that we come across a lot in DCU is around migration, which is one of the topics that just attracts so much vitriol and ideological opinion, and then just disinformation campaigns all over the world. But if you look at the academic literature, if you were to try and fact check it, academics have not agreed for the past 40 years about whether there's a relationship between migration and crime. And that's one of the most common disinformation topics. So they'll put out this story saying that, there's a wave of migration, crime has gone up. And I think it's because a lot of those issues are ideological, they are political, they're not about agreed facts. They come back to what are your values and what are your principles. And that's where it becomes quite difficult, and it's what are you prepared to defend as values and principles, and what are you prepared to walk away from?
And Stevie, is there any topic that you just wouldn't touch or not try to debunk?
I don't think I can afford to. I think, both Eileen and Barry have hit it on the head, but I think Barry in particular, big tech aren't going to do nothing or do something about this on their own. If you leave everything to it, it's just going to continue. We've seen, as I said earlier, how widely and how quickly things can spread. I think Ukraine is a really good example of what's going on in the world at the moment. We have this from with state down level, and I think we often think we're only seeing things in the English-speaking world. We think, like Trump is the pinnacle or Brexit is the pinnacle. Frances Hogan, when she spoke to the US Senate last year, was describing how disinformation was a huge part of what's going on in Myanmar. It's coming up in India and stuff now as well. I think we think that everything. If we leave it be, or we just ignore things, they will go away. But that's most certainly not the case. And I think the more we can arm each other with, we were talking earlier about anticipating narratives. I think one of the best examples I can think of that recently was just on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We were given a European briefing about kind of the narratives that Russia had been drumming up over the last several years before Ukraine. And then Putin gave us a big speech and repeated some of those narratives about how Ukraine was suppressing Russian-speaking people in the east of the country and all this sort of thing. And when you're able to be aware of that, as a news outlet, okay, we've got to be very careful about not repeating those claims, so that you get a situation where, I'm sure people saw Dave McCullough's interview with the Russian ambassador to Ireland, Yuri Filatov, in the news on the 6th one, where he just skewered all of the fake news lines that the ambassador was coming out with.
But it was a masterclass in interviewing for our students out there.
But just live debunking, and when you can do something like that, you really, really take the power out of it. But if you're not prepared for something like that, you can't do that. And so, like I say, like the disinformation narratives that we've started to see over the past few years, like they're not going to go away. And no, to go back to the question, like I don't think then, as a fact checker, you can kind of say I'm going to step away from that because it's just too, it's just too crazy. It's just too out there. You need to keep fighting.
And we talked a little bit about debunking and fact-checking and maybe some issues there. I mean, Eileen brought up pre-bunking, which is, if it's difficult to get people to change their minds after they've been exposed to false information, there's a way for us to get them to recognise it before they get sucked in. And Eileen, can you tell us how you would go about pre-bunking?
Well, it's quite an old idea, actually. It comes from social psychology in the 1960s, and they called it inoculation theory. So the idea was that you explain to somebody a piece of information or manipulation tactics, you expose them to it, and then they should be able to recognise it themselves when they see it in the wild. And then that was kind of left as it was as a piece of research until after the Trump election and then Brexit, and there was this wave of new research. And a lot of it's centred on games, so developing just simple interactive games where you play a manipulator. So you try and put out false narratives to show people how easy it is to do it, or to show people how you doctor images, that it's just very easy to do, so that people are more aware of it afterwards. And a lot of the research suggests that it is very effective.
Yeah, I've played that game. It is actually like sort of a masterclass in how these things work. And Stevie, we talk about pre-bunking, but is it is it just good old-fashioned media literacy? And do you think people are less or more media literate these days?
I mean, I can't answer the second question. I think there's a lot more. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, how the internet is like this new frontier, and so I think people are probably much more aware of kind of traditional media, but I think anyone is kind of susceptible to misinformation, particularly online, and it just kind of sort of depends on sort of what buttons you press, or like who you view as like an authority figure as being able to give out a piece of information that you trust. Otherwise, I mean, you know yourself, it's very, very difficult even as a journalist sometimes when someone puts a fact out there and you kind of have to go, is that really, really true?
Could it be?
Yeah. So I don't know if it's whether people are more or less media literate these days. It's just that there are different challenges for them to have to overcome and to encounter. I think particularly because the dissemination of information on the internet is so new that we're in a lot of cases still learning how things are done. Like even, we thought again we'd kind of seen everything that we could see in terms of disinformation through COVID, and then Russia comes along.
Couldn't get any worse.
No, exactly. And things just change again. So it's a constant battle for us to have to fight. But.
And Barry, how do we get more people to spot bad information off the bat? I mean, we talked about the solution being educational. We talked about the role of legislators maybe making it hard to access in the first place. What do you think is the way forward here?
Well, I mean, I'm not really in fact-checking in journalism. I mean, I would have thought that's just what journalists do, and so that there would be a department for fact-checking seems to me to, I thought everybody did that in journalism. I mean, so what changed for me, I mean, I'm in politics long enough to know that in the old days, journalists were given time to carry out thorough investigations in newspapers and in RTE and other places, and they were able to produce really fantastic investigative journalism, which is not as common as budgets shrank, as we had austerity, as advertising was cannibalized by the social media world. And so I think I think journalism has improved in the last few years in being able to challenge these narratives and take things on. And I think that's really critical. But I think Eileen pointed to a problem here, which is if these exercises that we're having right now are financed by the European Commission or the Irish government, that creates a problem with credibility for an awful lot of people, particularly those people that are hard to reach that we talked about before. But I think that, one of the recommendations we had in our initial report 2 or 3 months ago was to provide much better financing for journalism. If it's possible to do that without infecting journalism with the government stamp, which is really a difficult thing. So I really feel journalism has to play a huge role here. And what I make that point about fact-checking, because I think that that should be the core of what journalists do anyway.
I mean, when we talk about journalism, there's always my favourite thing a journalism teacher ever said, and it's the one always repeated, that if one politician says that it's raining and the other politician says that it's not, it's your job as a journalist to stick your head out the window and find out. But in the cycle of news cycles, you don't always, it's not as simple as sticking your head out the window. It could be looking through like 6 years worth of expenses reports. So then is the onus then on politicians not to spin in the first place and not to put that information out
well,
there?
spin is a bit different to disinformation, isn't it? I mean, you
How?
know, well, it's an influence. I mean, not all influence is disinformation. It's you're trying to say, marketing is a bit like that. This is the original and the best. We're going to make Ireland a great country again, and we make all these. I say make Ireland great again. It's probably not a great phrase that'll travel too well in Ireland, but so disinformation has that element of deception, deliberate deception, and it has that, and it has to be deliberate as well. So I think what politicians are doing, I think what politicians have to face up to challenging this stuff when it comes out, and it is difficult for the reason I pointed out. Once you get stuck into that swamp of disinformation, you just end up with absolutely horrendous stuff on your social media feeds then, and it's quite a challenge, really.
And before we move on talking about the EU and Irish response, I just want to ask both Eileen and Stevie, who are the people spreading this? Who are the spreaders? Is it politicians? Is it troll factories? What are you seeing out there, Eileen? Who's doing this, and why are they doing it? For money, fame? What's the point?
I think money is an important one that's often overlooked, particularly in Ireland. There are a lot of people who are just see it as a very easy way to make money, especially when COVID hit, that you could start soliciting funds for various legal cases, treatments and other things, and it's a nice way to build up a profile. Also, the way social media works is if you build up a profile, you can then sell advertising. There's an incentive to get an audience. And you can see that with figures who started out with maybe a fairly benign YouTube channel and then clearly realised that if they started talking about how women's rights has gone too far, gay rights have gone too far, they just got a lot more hits and they got a lot more traffic, particularly in the US. And they just pivot towards that. A lot of those people, I don't think they actually believe a lot of stuff they're saying, but it's a way to make money. And then, of course, you have people with very ideological beliefs. So we see a lot of people who'd be aligned towards the far right and the various terms that are used for that.
And Stevie, who are you seeing out there? Because you did fact-check a politician, but you have also been tracking the weird and wonderful world of other disinformation spreaders out there. Yeah, so what's your opinion on that?
Weird and wonderful is a way to put it, all right. I think just to add to what Eileen said as well, I in a lot of cases it's tied to people who are looking for money, but I think status is a big thing as well. And particularly when, you mentioned kind of fringe political elements who are looking to kind of gain a foothold in more mainstream politics, and they're trying to capture people who've been sort of whether it's left behind with the political system or have no faith in it anymore. But for them to be able to see, we're relying ourselves to these narratives that no one else will touch because political correctness has gone too far or anything like that. They're sort of sweeping up what's there around the edges. You can't put just a label on who's spreading out or who's out there spreading misinformation. It just comes from all across society. Like it was a kind of very interesting thing, and particularly in the UK, a little bit here, but during COVID, where you actually had this, link up of people who were just kind of on the fringe. It wasn't necessarily people who had like a very, very right-wing point of view, and there's kind of people who were like, maybe would traditionally have held, quite left-wing views as well, but just a general distrust in sort of authority and what's the official narrative and things, is where these people are coming from. But you can't just say, oh, it's from one aspect of society and that's it. It's kind of just taken over everywhere, really.
And when we talk about Ireland compared to the rest of Europe, do you think Irish people are more particularly vulnerable to misinformation? Do we have our own special local brand of misinformation? Are we different to what we're seeing out in the EU, Stevie?
It's kind of funny. I don't think so, in the sense that I go back to what I said earlier about the internet is like, the internet's not based in kind of one country. It's this kind of global disparate thing, and we see narratives that are imported in here from the US. It's kind of funny that the people who are on the right here would be kind of, you see them quite parroting the language of Trump, and they're hitting out at liberals here, and it's not like we have like a liberal party here or anything like that, So everyone's kind of influencing each other internationally, but in a sense we also do have our own kind of ecosystem. We have very prominent spreaders of misinformation here, who are globally renowned, particularly when it comes to COVID-19 and vaccines, through whatever profile they've gotten. And again, I think that's almost the reverse of that effect, where I said that you can see people who spread misinformation here importing language or themes or tropes from abroad. People have seen what we're doing here, and one or two individuals in particular who people say, oh, they actually know what they're talking about, they're going to go further afield. So we have that as well. But I guess the other interesting thing that we've noticed as well is that the European reports we get, you often see at the end of every month which fact checks or which narratives have been fact checked appear in each country, and quite often you see Ireland is kind of standing on its own and doesn't really have a lot of what, say, fact checkers in mainland Europe are fact checking. I don't necessarily know why that is. Whether it's because, again, you've got like Germany up close to France, or you've got people who are speaking German and in Germany and Austria, that kind of thing. But I can never tell why they don't gain as much of a foothold here. It's not like people crossing the border going for work or something in the same country, and they've got to travel over to Ireland, via the plane. It's just, I don't know, it's a very unique thing.
We don't have a far right party here now.
We have far right parties in the sense.
We don't have anything like AfD in Germany with over 12 or 13%, or Marine Le Pen on 23% at the weekend. The Brexit party in the UK. We have nothing like that in Ireland. And I think the susceptibility thing is a little bit around social isolation, whereas in Ireland there's a very high degree of social capital, actually, where people are connected to each other.
You're saying because we're friendly.
Well, no, I think that's a little bit shorthand.
It's interesting because we interviewed psychologists around this.
But I think the social capital in Ireland, we're some of the strongest volunteers in the world. We always come at the top of a global index in volunteerism and charity, which means also donating your time, and that's a lot to do with sport, things like the GAA, and these kind of social links in Ireland mean there's probably less social isolation in Ireland, therefore less susceptibility. But we also don't have a far-right party in whose interest it would be to propagate the kind of narratives that are gaining foothold elsewhere.
That's really interesting, because of the GAA, we're maybe less right-wing and don't fear immigrants as much. That's a pretty interesting topic to study. Eileen, do you think we need an EU-wide response, or do we need a local response tailored specifically to Ireland, do you think?
I think we need both. And just to pick up what Stephen and Barry were saying, I think Ireland's interesting in that we're a small English-speaking country wedged between Britain and the US, which have both been basket cases for the last 5 or 6 years. So when we do surveys in Ireland, people are very concerned about disinformation, but they don't necessarily see it as being a massive Irish issue. It's because they're watching it from the UK and from the US. We also, in comparison to other European countries, have quite high trust in traditional media, which is very interesting, because what you have in the US and in the UK is this collapse of trust in news media accompanying all of that disinformation. I do think there's some particular local strand, and I wouldn't say this is disinformation in itself, but there's this narrative that's taking hold across all spheres, whatever controversy it is, whether it's sport, and it's this Dublin versus the rest of the country narrative that has always been there, but it's really kicked up a gear recently, and is often accompanied by false claims like, if this was happening in Dublin, something would be done about it. And I think that's actually quite destructive, and it might go against a bit what you were saying about the strong social ties, because there's the seeds of social division within that narrative, I think, and I'm just seeing it much more often now.
Yeah, I think it's very much in the climate debate. But I just add one more thing that just occurs to me, if you don't mind, which is about our electoral system. We have this system of incredibly competitive direct election called PRS-TV. And there'll be 4 or 5 politicians in the one area, and they're competing for every single vote. And it's just as likely that a politician will come to your door on any given day as, in other countries, access has to be paid for. People are elected off lists. They don't ever see their constituents.
There's bigger populations as well.
Well, I mean, proportionately, Irish people feel a connection with their political system, and they know they can change things. I was a group of, we had 80 members of the Dáil in 2007. By 2011, we had 17. So, it was an incredible change to the system, and people feel, why was there no rebellion in Ireland in 2008, 2011? Why were there no protests? Why were there no strikes? There was not a single strike in that period, because people felt we put them there. We felt an ownership to them, and they felt a proximity to it. And I think when you're examining, because it's all about democracy, if people feel in France, for example, the only way to affect change is through protest, then I think the ground is more susceptible for disinformation. And I think it's part of the reason why it's not gaining as much traction in Ireland as other parts of Europe.
It's a pretty interesting thing to think about. We're going to throw questions now over to the audience. Does anyone have a question for our panel? It's always hard to be the first one, so we appreciate that.
No, sorry. I was just going to ask generally, but particularly to Barry. Earlier you were asked about spins being put on information that's given to our citizens, and you kind of made a reference quantifying it to marketing in the sense that spins are being put on them. But would you not think, in the same way with journalism, there's an integrity that there should be more responsibly put on our politicians to have that fact-checking, and maybe if there would be disciplinary action taken or platforms removed when feeding that information to constituents who you said earlier they're more connected to and have more trust in than a marketing agency?
Yeah, let's say that sounds like a good idea for government TDs. But if the government are dealing with opposition TDs and being able to somehow or another x-ray all of their claims, which are very contestable, then I think you might open up something that you don't really intend to do. Politics has to be an open marketplace for ideas, and when you make factual assertions that have that are incorrect, then the opposition's job is to demonstrate that that's not the case. And that goes on all the time. If you begin to try to engineer that, I wonder what you end up with. I think it just becomes a difficult thing. That's why I think journalism plays a critical role here, to stick the head out the window and find out if it's raining or not.
I mean, but back to the excellent question.
Yeah, it is an excellent question.
You talked about it being the opposition's job to call the wrong party out, but shouldn't the wrong party just not make the statement in the first place?
Yes, they shouldn't
maybe get like a big red sticker that says bullshit.
No, absolutely. No, I totally agree. No, you're right. But I'm just worried about the unintended consequences. It's the freezing effect on debate. It's like saying, well, around defamation and what the freezing effect that has on investigative journalism. So you can be over-engineer something and end up with quite a negative consequence. And I think politics is, the debating space of politics where arguments stand up on their merits or not. It's very difficult to come in with a regulatory scheme that could work. I would think, just off the top of my head now, I haven't It is an excellent question and very much one worthy of debate, I would have thought.
It was an excellent question. Does anyone else have any questions for our panellists? Throwing open the floor.
There's a lady behind you there.
Eileen, you mentioned about independent research initiatives for verifying content that's coming out of like the Syrian conflict. This is just on a very small scale for me. I was writing a politics essay about the war, or not war, but a conflict between Palestine and Israel. And my lecturer told me, maybe try and avoid articles that are from American institutes. And then I was in a position where I didn't know what website to go to, which was completely verified and would have authentic information that was independent. And obviously, you're saying Google is funding these initiatives, but how do you make a platform that people will go to and there's nothing in their head going, oh, well, is there a connection to, you're saying Google, but like my lecturer told me, avoid kind of American influence. How do you make it so that someone can kind of think, this is definitely 100% independent? Would you have any ideas on that?
That's a really good question, and I think the answer is there will never be anything that you can 100% trust. And that maybe, I don't know if this is an optimistic or a pessimistic thing, but in the past, before we had the web and the internet, we were very reliant on books, and we were told to trust the book, whatever's written in the encyclopedia. In our house, we had the Encyclopedia Britannica, which had a whole bunch of nonsense about cricket being Ireland's most popular sport. So I knew not to trust anything that was written in this book. And there was nowhere else to go. You couldn't get information anywhere else. So the internet was amazing to open up knowledge, but then it opens it up so much that the burden is now on each one of us to go, do I trust this? There's a big concern that if we say, and it's not that you look at who funds something, that then you just don't trust it because it's funded by someone. So in the case of, say, like the project that I work on, that's funded by the European Commission, but it's funded and structured in a way that, the Commission isn't telling us what to do. And that's what's really difficult to understand. And that's where I think the critical thinking and just educating the public more about how do you go out and do that work. But that's not easy. And to be realistic, it's great that you went to that effort to look at who was funding those things, but we can't all do that every single time. And we will eventually go, well, I generally trust that source, so I'm going to see what they're saying, but then maybe look at other sources and see what those are saying as well. So there is no easy solution.
The flip side of that as well, it's kind of funny that, one of the catchphrases of people who are maybe skeptical towards vaccines is, I've done my research, and you kind of like, you have taken away that moment where you're like, okay, well, I'm going to listen to this one person, there's one body that might be the HSE or whatever, who's saying, okay, get the vaccine, it's safe, or politicians saying, yes, it's safe, but they go, well, actually, I'm going to go and do my own research and see what sources that I trust, is kind of like what you're saying as well. If someone said to you, don't trust the health service or don't trust politicians, you go, okay, well, I'll go and look for that source somewhere else. It's kind of like, I don't know how you strike the balance with that. It's a very, very difficult thing at the moment.
And it's that line between cynicism and skepticism. So we ought to be skeptical, but know that we can go and maybe research something. Whereas just being cynical, I think we're all doomed if that's where we end up.
We got any more?
I know you were talking about big tech earlier, and obviously, like, it is an uphill battle with, extreme lobbyists and like the EU and the US and everything like that. But I suppose moving into the future, what do you want to see from big tech in an effort to combat, growing misinformation that are on their platforms?
That's a very good one. What's on your wish list? Barry, you look like you're ready to go.
What we want from big tech is transparency. We want to know the data. We want to know how they're taking things down. We want to know the rate of it. We don't have that information. We don't know how many people are employed on it. We don't know how many languages are being used and how regularly. So I was in Iraq in October for the election, and we were in Baghdad, and so I was trying to get in under the lid of how the social media environment was in an election. So they'd introduced this thing whereby 25% of successful candidates had to be women. And so you could have the top 7 candidates after the election being men, and the person who came 8th, a woman came 8th, she would leapfrog 3 or 4 candidates so to satisfy this requirement. And it was advised that none of these women should circulate in public for 2 weeks after the election.
For security reasons.
For security reasons. But they had been so intimidated on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. But, if you go to California, they haven't a clue about this. So in English, it's quite good. Tracking, transparency, data, it's very difficult beyond that in the multiple languages, whether it's Khmer or any other language, difficult to reach for these social media companies. So that's what we're looking for in the Digital Services Act. The Digital Markets Act then is all about competition and trying to make sure that there isn't abuse of dominant position. But at the moment, these companies are so big, they are the market. So those 2 pieces of legislation are really critical, and they're worth monitoring. But the problem with European legislation is that it takes forever to go through, and then very often it has to be transposed into national law in each of the member states. So I'm working on a piece of legislation right now, which is called due diligence, about supply chains, and it's a collective yawn if I ever mention it, because it'll be 2030 before it impacts the way companies actually procure products within human rights and environmental standards. So it just takes so long for these pieces of legislation to actually have an effect. Unlike, for example, the digital COVID certificate, which came in like that. So Europe can act quickly when necessary, but it's quite rare.
Eileen, what would you like from these companies?
Oh, be accountability at a very, very basic level. So we're in this completely absurd situation where everybody, and in particular politicians, talk about disinformation as this massive concern. They're willing to invest in it. And the research community is not able to give clear answers about what is the scale of this problem, how does it impact people, does it impact people, in what circumstances, because they have no way to answer those questions because the tech platforms do not share the data. I heard a very good analogy, which would be like if we were back in the 70s asking, is smoking related to cancer? And the only way we could answer that question would be if the tobacco companies volunteered to give us the data and they just chose not to. So I think the number one thing is to just force them to actually share information. And providing transparency isn't enough, because providing transparency about algorithms, unless you understand what's actually going on there, which, as you were saying, Francis Hagan said hardly anyone actually does, it's meaningless being transparent about a complex thing. So accountability means having experts who can go in and audit them, force them to hand over the information that's needed.
And Stevie, what are your thoughts on this?
All of the above, but I think I'd add one more thing to it, which is even a more basic acknowledgement that their platforms are hotbeds of misinformation. I think Facebook, for all of the stick that it's given, and I can't believe I'm giving Facebook credit for anything here, but for all the stick that's been given, are at least flagging their own content or posts on their platform as misinformation. We're not really seeing that with YouTube. We're not seeing it with Twitter. Twitter have set up a version of flagging content.
We saw that with Trump. We saw them mark the tweets.
It's not nearly quick enough. It's almost that they're doing the bare minimum just to say, we're tackling this problem. It does work when you actually flag content and people see it, and you kind of have that leap between clicking into it and the way, I don't know if anyone has seen it, the way the Facebook misinformation flag works is that, say there's a photo and it contains a falsehood. If it's flagged as misinformation on Facebook, it kind of goes grey and say this post is false and click Y to see. But even anything like that on the other platforms would be, a welcome first step. There's so much more to do, as Barry and Eileen have just said, but I would take that immediately if they can do it.
Is there any other questions out there? These have all been excellent questions, by the way. You're kind of putting me on the spot here as the panel moderator.
So I just wanted to ask, the Electoral Commission bill is before the Dáil right now. It's at second stage. What would you put into the bill to protect Irish elections? Because that legislation is in train right now.
Well, I'm not in the Irish Parliament. People always say that to me, about Irish politics, but I don't know. looking under the hood of Irish legislation, we deal with European legislation. But what I would like to see is, I'm just astonished in 2019, because I didn't run since 2011, I was out of politics for a long time, that you can't canvass in any particular part of town, you can't put up posters in loads of places, people can't run for local elections because they're in a private company. You can't go into the financial services centre and walk around and hand out a leaflet. And don't be surprised then when people don't want to run for election, people don't show up to vote, and then RTE have to give 50-50 coverage so they don't bother at all.
Yeah,
so you've just got a ridiculous situation where democracy is in recession across the world, as we know, and what we have now is a shrinking space for democratic activity. And I'm talking about elections specifically. And the other thing is the electoral register, which is a farce at the moment. I don't know how to fix that, but I think we have a very healthy political system in Ireland, a very democratic system in terms of PRS TV compared to list systems in other countries, in that we're directly elected. You might say, oh, well, we don't get any experts, whereas in France, it's incredible. The MEPs that have come from France, they're all professor of this, they're the doctor of that, they've had a multi-million-euro company, and they're all wild experts. And then in Ireland, we're all kind of people, but we've come up through the ranks in a way, so maybe there's a balance to be struck for expertise. What I'd like to see in Ireland is that the government should be able to put people into the cabinet who are experts. I saw that in 2008 when the country fell apart and we had austerity, and the cabinet was the same before as it had been, as it was afterwards. It should have been a major change in the face of the cabinet to bring in experts that were appropriate to the crisis that we're facing. But we don't have that system either. So there are deficits in the Irish electoral system, but I think it's been eroded very dramatically in the last 20 years.
Eileen, would you make some changes?
Well, on the communication side, I know there was an effort to look at online political advertising, which is actually quite valuable because it allows, it's quite cheap. So for smaller parties or new candidates, online political advertising is very useful. But at the moment, the platforms only provide very scant data about what kind of money was spent on that, who was it targeted at, and they don't have to provide it in real time, so journalists have no space to actually investigate those things before an election. So I think that's one thing. And then there's no effort to directly address disinformation, which partly because it's such a difficult thing to define. But if part of our concerns are what has happened in the UK with Brexit and just false claims being used during a campaign, it seems a bit strange to me that we're not even trying to directly get at that. Like, what are the consequences for a political party if they were to outright lie in an election campaign?
Stephen, would you like to see some consequences there?
Yeah, I guess, it's kind of difficult, and as Eileen said, how do you define disinformation and how do you, again, legislate for that? Barry's discussed the problem with that already. I think the regulation side of things probably isn't as strong as it could be. We've seen one political party in Ireland which would be not averse to spreading falsehoods about things, which is not really active anymore, but for the past couple of years has failed to file proper paperwork with SIPO, and SIPO essentially said that we can't really do anything about that. So I think, it's a clear example of a party that has broken the rules, and there's not enough strength to kind of combat that, and it's very, very low key and very low stakes. But you kind of wonder if something more dramatic happened. We've seen where the political system is used quite cynically and not fantastically regulated, what the consequences of that are in both the UK and the US kind of recently. I think, yeah, any more power that we can kind of give SIPO would be a very, very welcome thing, I think.
Great. Was that our last question? I think that might be. Thank you so much for asking those brilliant questions. We do have one last question from myself, and that is going to get everyone to answer this one, and I want you to all to have a think about what you think is the biggest threat to the truth in 2022. Does anyone want to kick us off?
Russia. In one word, in my opinion.
Don't be subtle about it.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, but Russia has determined about 10 years ago that democracy didn't suit Putin, so he reinvented himself as the president again, and he had to demonstrate that the alternative to what he was offering Russian people, democracy, was weak and corrupt, and he spent the last 10 years developing these narratives and pushing through weaknesses in public policy in the West, and was highly successful in the area of migration, where we still have a mainstream view of migration as a security issue and not as an opportunity or cultural opportunity, not from a humanitarian point of view. We still have, I certainly count myself as looking at migration from a humanitarian point of view. We're still fighting that narrative. So these have come from Russia. It happened in Syria. It happened in Georgia. It happened in Chechnya, and now it's happening in Ukraine. It happened around the pandemic, around migration, with different degrees of success, and I think that's where the great source of it. I think China as well. More subtle influence exercises, even here in Ireland, which we don't have time to go into. So I'll stop there.
Dr. Culloty, what do you think?
I think it is the lack of consequences, because I've become obsessed with Boris Johnson's government, because it's just unbelievable how he and his ministers just lie on such a consistent basis about really absurd things. And there's no shame or dishonour when these lies are pointed out to them. They just keep going. And it's the lack of consequences that means like there's a message being sent there that you can get away with this. And I think that even in Ireland we mightn't have had anything to that extreme. But if that's the message that gets out there, if you just write these things out, that's really scary. And it's not just in politics. We also see it with corporations that run these PR campaigns about diversity and how great they are, and yet their practices and their lobbying points, to things they're doing that are completely opposed to that. And also they just write it out. So if there's no consequences on the part of the public, that's what I think is quite scary.
And Stephen, what do you think is the biggest threat to truth?
Probably inequality. I think we've seen how being locked out of the political system Eileen talked earlier about the line between scepticism and cynicism, and if you're locked out of the system, you become a cynic, and you think that politicians are untrustworthy, you think that media is untrustworthy, you think that everyone's out to get you, and so you start forming these worldviews that says, oh, the system is rigged and everyone's doing jobs for each other to kind of keep me down. I think it's not a coincidence that we've seen the likes of Brexit or the likes of a Trump election, and you can have, as Eileen just discussed, the Tories in government, and they kind of are able to lie consequence-free because people just expect them to do that because they think that the system is rigged. And this has all gone on since 2008, when a lot of people started becoming locked out of the system. And I think while the likes of the big tech companies are the vehicle for a lot of disinformation and threaten the truth, I think it's the system that people exist in, which is allowing them to connect with other people, that makes them go, oh, you're locked out as well, and I'm locked out, so we can discuss why we feel locked out, and you get these narratives cropping up. So yeah, I think it is inequality.
Well, that's all we have time for this evening. Thank you so much for joining us here in Cork for a lovely evening. Big thank you to our panellists, Barry Andrews, Dr Eileen Culloty, and of course, Stephen McDermott. Big thank you to our audience who got up their time this afternoon to join us here, and of course, everyone watching on the live stream and later on the playback. You can check out and get a bit more information. Go check out the Good Information Project on the Journal's website. We also have an email. It just says good information, all lowercase, goodinformation@thejournal.ie. Please email us your feedback, your comments, your suggestions on how to help distinguish facts from fiction. Please send us suggestions for the articles and the other things that will be coming up. We're going to be doing a whole month on disinformation. Thanks so much for your time.